Hello, History 17B Spring Quarter 2024, and welcome to Lecture 8. Lecture 8 here finishes out Module B, the period after the Civil War, which covers, in my scheme, basically 1870s, 1880s. You have seen this map before. This is what the United States looked like immediately after the American Civil War. We've discussed the South, the Northeast, and to an extent the West Coast, at least in terms of immigration from China. In this lecture, we will finish U.S. conquest of the West and the mythical end of the frontier. This map represents what the U.S. actually looked like in 1866. Only the parts in green. The white areas were home to different peoples, like the Utes and Paiutes of the Great Basin region, and to the north of it, the Nez Perce, Apache and Comanche down here in what is now the American Southwest, and the Lakota, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Crow in the Middle North. This is what the United States looked like to President Johnson and his government when he took over the U.S. presidency after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. We will zoom in closer on the West in this map, but before we do, we can note two things. First, this is envisioned as a military map showing forts and military posts. The fact that the U.S. had an enlarging presence in the western half of North America goes with what we know of American efforts to displace Native Americans, even as much of the Army was tied up with the Civil War and then Reconstruction. The other thing to notice is that there are no Native American groups shown or named on this map. In the minds of most white Americans at the time, Indians were all part of one group and they should all just disappear quietly. Of course, Indians considered themselves different groups of people with differing needs, although all now faced existential confrontation with the U.S. Army and so-called settlers, white folks who considered Indians to be interlopers on their own land. If we zoom in on Johnson's military map, we can see more clearly that Native Americans do not exist in this vision, except in Indian Territory down here, which we've discussed as the place to which Native American groups were sent when they were pushed out of what became the American South. We can also see that the territories as conceived by the U.S. government at the time do not correspond perfectly to states now. Washington Territory sort of bluffs down to the east here of Oregon. The Dakota and Nebraska territories are larger and smaller strips, as are New Mexico and Arizona. In this lecture, we will look at an overview of U.S. policy and actions regarding Indians in the western half of North America, the methods of U.S. occupation, and the ways that white American ideas of family and individual property spelled even greater disaster for Native Americans. The intention of the U.S. government was always settlement of as much of North America as possible. The reality was that the land already had people on it. The 17A half of this course deals with the displacement of Native American groups to the east of the Mississippi by both English and Spanish colonizers and disruptions in the American Southwest and California with Spanish incursion. The big thing to know about in 17B here is that Native American groups had been pushed into one another by colonizers since at least the 1600s. They had recombined and reformed in ways that both included and resisted European and Euro-American settlers as the situation warranted over the ensuing 250 years or so. The groups that we will be looking at already had a long history of either direct or indirect contact with the American government. This that I have on the slide on the left is one of the readings that I have offered you for Module B. It is, as others of my readings are the introduction to a book. I've given you the table of contents as well, so that you could think about the way that Ostler has tried to make a cohesive narrative out of history, which is a messy mix of often contradictory stories. I've pulled a quote from what you have in your PDF here. I want to discuss all of it, so I've broken it down into bite-sized pieces. The first part here says, "It is no longer possible to think of the closing of the frontier in the late 19th century as the last days of the Sioux Nation. Like Native people throughout the Americas, the Plains Sioux have survived. At the same time, it is important to keep in mind the general observation that people do not make history under circumstances chosen by themselves." I want you to take the two highlighted parts to think about. We will see the myth of the frontier shaping an American identity again and again in the telling of American history. As with the melting pot story, this was meant to make American identity synonymous with white English-speaking Protestant. The second highlighted part is really at the heart of part one of this lecture. So I'm going to use that as a lead-in to the next section of the quote. People do not make history under circumstances chosen by themselves. We also need to be reminded that survival is not the same as freedom. Rather than choosing between a narrative of agency and persistence on the one hand, and power and domination and genocide on the other, my goal, meaning Ostler's, has been to write a history that combines these elements and explores their relations. I have had, back to me being me, I have had people quote the axiom that the victor writes history. While there is some truth to that, it rests on the assumption that everything must be a winner-take-all competition. This is the assumption that underlay the wholesale displacement and killing of Native Americans by the United States government. I would like to think it is worthwhile to upset that assumption and give ourselves other choices in the history we write, as well as in the lives that we lead. That's my preachy bit out of the way for now, because I also know that we do not make unconstrained choices, and the telling of history is never going to be objective. Going back to Ostler, to do this, telling a story not all at one pole or the other, I have searched for a variety of Sioux voices and tried to interpret them within a changing and diverse cultural context. I encourage you to keep reading from this quote and to read Ostler's whole introduction, because it makes these points in a solid and readable way. For now, I'm just going to note that he has a book in which to tell his story, and I have half an hour or so. This story I am using to illustrate part one of lecture 7 is entwined with but different from the story that Ostler tells. So having both will enhance your understanding. Our part one story is going to center on Black Kettle here in this photograph, who was a member of the Council of 44 Chiefs of the Cheyenne people. Understanding movements and interactions between groups of Native Americans before or even during European interference is tricky, because what historical records existed, European colonizers often destroyed. Looking at language distribution, this is a really broad map. The Cheyenne language is in the Algonquin group, and before 1700, the Cheyenne lived in the region just to the west of the western tip of the Great Lakes, in what is now marked Ojibwe and Dakota. Oral tradition holds that the Cheyenne had occupied an area to the northeast of the Great Lakes before European arrival. Pressure from British and to an extent French colonization pushed some groups westward into the Cheyenne, in turn pushing the Cheyenne further west in the process. I will also comment on this map before we leave it that the Muskogee and Cherokee groups here, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, as well as the Cherokee, were the ones who were gathered up in the Trail of Tears and forced into what was then called Indian Territory by the United States. And we'll see that again in a moment. Back to the Cheyenne moved piecemeal early on, village by village, and over an extended period of years. Their political organization was not that of a nation state with hard borders where everyone retreated at once. With more pressure from neighboring groups, bands of Cheyenne moved west into the Cheyenne River Valley. Under pressure from the Ojibwa, the Cheyenne moved again band by band over an extended period of time to settle along the Missouri River. Continuing pressure from other Indian groups who were themselves pressured by groups pressured by European and then American colonization to the east pushed the Cheyenne into the Black Hills and eventually split the group into a northern segment and a southern group on the two branches of the Platte River here. This map gives a broader, more comprehensive, although less detailed view of Native American distribution as a result of westward pressure by Anglo-Americans to 1841. All of the Cheyenne are lumped together with all of the Arapaho, but you can see the amount of pressure and squeezing between Indian groups that was going on in this broad band. And you'll see Cherokee, Creek and Seminole, Chickasaw, all Choctaw, all squeezed into this region. Arapaho and Cheyenne can't really even see their region. Looking at the view from the U.S. federal government, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun administratively established, that means he didn't really get permission from Congress, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, within his department. Note that was the Department of War on March 11, 1824. Congress later legislatively established the Bureau and Commissioner of Indian Affairs via an act on 9 July 1832. In 1849, the BIA was transferred to the newly created Interior Department. In the years that followed, the Bureau was known variously as the Indian Office, the Indian Bureau, the Indian Department, and the Indian Service. So you may see any or all of those in reading that you do. In 1851, the United States invited, in quotes, meaning they didn't leave much choice, all of the native nations of the northern Great Plains, including both groups of the Cheyenne, to gather for a treaty council at the mouth of Horse Creek near Fort Laramie, where Nebraska and Wyoming now meet. Two negotiators from the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs met with delegations representing 9 native nations, although the invitation and resulting treaty failed to recognize the Cheyenne as 2 separate groups. Basically, the Native Americans who took part wanted to keep their people alive, and the representatives of the U.S. government planned to claim land. The resulting treaty is called both the Horse Creek Treaty and the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The treaty is written on 4 pieces of parchment stitched together with blue ribbon. The Native American delegates' names are down in the bottom right column, but the extracts on the right basically sum up the treaty. Horse Creek Treaty. Articles of a treaty made and concluded at Fort Laramie in the Indian Territory between Indian agent commissioners specially appointed and authorized by the President of the United States and the chiefs, headmen, and braves of the Sioux or Dakotas, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crows, Assiniboine, Gros Ventre or Hidatsa, Mandans, and Arikaras. The aforesaid nations do hereby recognize the right of the United States government to establish roads, military, and other posts within their respective territories. In consideration of the rights and privileges acknowledged in the preceding article, the United States bind themselves to protect the aforesaid Indian nations against the commission of all depredations by the people of the said United States after ratification of this treaty. Note they're promising protection. Last bit. The aforesaid Indian nations do hereby recognize and acknowledge the following tracts of country included within the metes and boundaries hereinafter designated as their respective territories. What this boiled down to was that all of the groups that met were assigned land reserved for them by the US government, thus the name reservation. The original map on the left is kind of difficult to make out, so I have the map on the right to help out. Both the Arapaho and all of the Cheyenne were assigned the pinkish bit in the south here, which actually contains Fort Laramie. This is where we pick up Black Kettle. Upon the death of his father-in-law in 1854, Black Kettle became chief of the Wutakio band of the Cheyenne. With the movement of white gold seekers to Colorado in 1859, Chief Black Kettle advocated a policy of peace and accommodation. He signed the Fort Wise Treaty of 1861 to obtain supposedly secure lands for his people. The Fort Wise Treaty agreed to concentrate Black Kettle's people near Sand Creek in Colorado. If you look at this map, you could compare the 1851 treaty territory and the 1861 treaty territory. And this is Sand Creek along here. By 1864, white settlers had invaded Cheyenne land, killing people, and another Cheyenne group, not Black Kettles, had killed some settlers in retaliation. Chief Black Kettle tried to communicate with volunteer U.S. Army units to negotiate peace. Finally, one of his people was able to deliver a letter to Major Edward Wynkoop, the commanding officer at Fort Lyon. Black Kettle succeeded in securing a council with Major Wynkoop in the Camp Weld Conference held on 28 September 1864, so a year before the end of the Civil War, just to put that in our previous context. Reporting to Fort Lyon, Chief Black Kettle was directed by the American military to return to Sand Creek and await an official Army delegation. On 29 November 1864, Colonel John Chivington, leader of the 3rd Colorado Volunteers, attacked Black Kettle's camp near Fort Lyon. Even though the chief tied an American flag along with a white banner to the end of a lodgepole and stood waving it, the soldiers commenced firing. They shot one of Black Kettle's wives 9 times. Incredibly, she survived, but more than 200 Cheyenne died in the Sand Creek Massacre, many women and children. In October 1865, Black Kettle, trying to keep the few people he had alive, accepted the Little Arkansas Treaty, which exchanged the Sand Creek Reservation for land in southwestern Kansas. I won't go through the remaining treaties and movements. This is where the Cheyenne were supposed to all go, along with the Arapaho, according to the U.S. government in the final set of treaties. You will recognize this as what is now Oklahoma, the small region called Indian Territory, into which the southeastern groups like the Cherokee had already been squeezed. This is only one story of one leader and one band, but this space was assigned to all of the Cheyenne, regardless of their individual courses of action. They were promised food and annuities to keep them alive, food that never came. In 1868, General Philip Sheridan ordered U.S. armed forces to undertake a winter campaign against Indians, no differentiation made, who were responsible for raids against settlers. Basically, they were trying not to starve. Guided by Osage scouts, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry followed the tracks of a Kiowa raiding party. Notice again, not Black Kettle's group, but they followed the group to 47 lodges camped on the Washita River. On 27 November 1868, Custer's troops charged into Black Kettle's village. Black Kettle and his wife, Medicine Woman, attempted to flee the so-called Battle of Washita, but a volley of bullets killed them. Black Kettle's band at that point included only women, children, and elderly people. Custer was greeted by the U.S. as a hero for ordering their slaughter. I've included the Ohio Statesman article, or at least the top bit of it. You can see that it didn't hit the news there until a month and a half after it happened. And if you can stomach it, you can read how it was reported. The previous section made the point that brave frontiersmen did not conquer the West. The U.S. Army did. The American government was also instrumental in the success of railroads and white land claims. The so-called Transcontinental Railroad was not the only major east-west rail line. You might remember the Northern Pacific from an earlier lecture, and there was also a southern line that connected it in with Mexico. However, the Transcontinental Railroad through the center of North America was a big deal to people at the time. The Union Pacific built west from Omaha, Nebraska. And it started there and not actually on the other side of the continent because there were already railroad systems in the east. The Central Pacific built east from Sacramento, California, which is why Sacramento has a big railroad museum now. Track was later extended to San Francisco. The two lines met at Promontory Point, Utah. The two railroads are different lengths because the Union Pacific was laid across relatively flat Great Plains, and the Central Pacific went through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Timber for trestles to build the bridges and railroad ties could be got from the Pacific Northwest, but everything else, iron rails, equipment, the trains themselves, the train engines in the cars, was too big and heavy to be taken on wagon trails across land. These things had to be shipped either around and across the Isthmus of Panama, no connecting canal yet, or all the way around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. Building the Transcontinental Railroad and doing it the way they did was ridiculously expensive, especially the part built from Sacramento. The Central Pacific Railroad, CPPR, was financially underwritten by a group of powerful tycoons known as the Big Four. You've seen this image before. Stanford's name is on Stanford University, Huntington's is on the Huntington Library, and Crocker's is on Crocker Art Museum. Hopkins is probably memorialized somewhere, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. If you know, let me know. When we say that the railroad was underwritten by this group, it seems like these men put their money behind the railroad project. But to all intents and purposes, they offloaded the risk onto the U.S. government. The Big Four sold government-backed bonds. The idea is that lots of little people buy the bonds and the money they pay goes to build the railroad. If the railroad is a success, they, the little people, could make money by selling the bonds and getting their value plus interest. But if the railroad failed, it would be the U.S. government that paid the value of the bond, not these guys. The plan was that the railroad owners would pay the government back once the railroad money started coming in. In fact, the government got only a fraction of the $77 million of Americans' money back. Plus, the government covered around $43 million in deferred interest payments, and they covered that completely. Those were 19th century dollars, each of which could buy far more than $1 now. The U.S. government also funded the railroad using the Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864. You are looking at the 1862 Act on the left. These acts granted the railroads hundreds of millions of acres, which the railroad could then sell to the public to encourage westward settlement by white Americans, extending effective U.S. control. Basically, the U.S. and the railroads sold lands that did not belong to them, which is one reason that the U.S. Army was employed to remove Native American people from their homes and move them all to a relatively tiny bit of land called Indian Territory. Notice that if we look at the ad on the right here, notice that it's not just farming land being offered, but also lands with mineral rights like coal. Coal mining is not a small family business. The land was distributed like this in a checkerboard pattern. The U.S. gave the squares shown in black. So this is the railroad line here, down the middle, and down the middle in this view. The U.S. gave the squares shown in black to the railroads to sell, and the U.S. government kept the white squares to distribute themselves with things like the Homestead Act. The railroads received 10 sections initially along the right-of-way or sides of every mile of track laid. That went up to 20 sections in 1864 and later up to 40 sections. The map on the top shows a stretch through Wyoming territory. You may remember that the track there headed north through that region in order to make access to coal mines profitable for the folks who could own the mines, folks who could buy up lots of squares without ever moving west themselves. You may also remember the treatment of Chinese laborers by these owners from the last lecture, and that inasmuch as people who survived the Rock Springs massacre and were forced back to work along with still violent white miners had protection, that protection was provided by the U.S. Army. The Army was used to protect profits, not people. The other thing that this map here shows is so-called reserves, outlined in the dark red, kind of yellowish, or Indian reservations. As you know from part one of these lectures, the bargain was that if Native American people gave up their homes to white Americans, including railroad owners, the U.S. Army would be somewhat less likely to kill them. Because timber was needed for building railroads and then towns, settlers were encouraged to plant timber or trees on the alternating plots that they bought. The remains of this pattern can actually be seen from the air in some places now. The green image is fairly straightforward. You have squares of trees and squares of nut trees. In the lower checkerboard, the white areas are where snow has settled because the trees have been felled, cut down. The dark areas are covered in timber, and you can see that checkerboard pattern quite clearly. The land grants were not limited to the transcontinental railroads. They were given to local branch lines as well. Very little of this land was bought directly by settlers. Most of it was bought by speculators for low prices and sold on to farmers or mining companies for a large profit. Two things about the ad on the right. First, if anything is ever offered to you with very long credit, run. What that actually means is a lifetime of interest payments. Also note, the land being sold is described as North Platte lands and South Platte lands. You might recognize that as the land of the northern and southern branches of the Cheyenne from part one of this lecture. One last thing before I leave the railroads. This is a famous image showing the celebration at the meeting of the two sides of the Transcontinental Railroad. The two men shaking hands in the center are the railroad owners. You might recognize the bearded one on the left as Leland Stanford. The last spike driven into the joined rails was called the Golden Spike, and it was Stanford who ceremoniously hammered it into place. You see that there are actual workers in the photo, but you also see that not one of them is Chinese. Some of you may have noticed that the Railroad Act of 1862 came at the same time as the Homestead Act of 1862. If you think about the checkerboard of land given to the railroads, the squares kept by the government were offered to people who would do what was called homesteading. Someone who is 21 years old and the head of a family could file for 160 acres of land. If the person lived on the land for 5 years and, quote, improved it in the eyes of the white US government, doing things like building a house, digging a well, plowing 10 acres, and putting up fences, they could keep the land for free at the end of 5 years. And you see a homesteading family here. It was also possible, however, to buy up land directly rather than living on it for $1.25 an acre, which sounds like nothing now, but it was more at the time. And then whoever bought the land could forego the development plan. Just as with the railroad lands, speculators were quick to buy up government land and then sell it to homesteaders, with the speculators making a tidy profit. Between direct claims by settlers and the sale of lands by speculators, the U.S. distributed 170 million acres between 1870 and 1930. Note that goes all the way to 1930. 170 million acres that had been home to other people. Homesteading was definitely not a paradise of equality, but it was more equitable than most of American society at the time. If you watched the coda on exodusters, then you know that Black people could and did make homesteading claims. This was also true of people from Mexico who intended to stay and become U.S. citizens. The border between Mexico and the U.S. was open at that time. Women could and did also file homesteading claims, assuming the role of head of the family, either because the husband had died or deserted, or because there had never been a husband at all, which I think is the case in this one, since these all look like women who are about the same age, college-age women maybe. Native Americans could also file homesteading claims, but not for groups or communities, only single families, recognized as families by the U.S. government. And remember that the land was to be farmed and fenced, antithetical to the lifeways of many of the Native Americans who had been removed from the land to make way for homesteaders. The Dawes Act of 1887 was formally titled An Act to Provide for the Allotment of Lands in Severalty to Indians on the Various Reservations. It emphasized severalty, meaning the treatment of Native Americans as individuals only, rather than as members of tribes with relationships to one another. This piece of legislation, the Dawes Act, is also known as the General Allotment Act. Federal Indian policy during the period from 1870 to 1900 shifted away from removal, treaties, reservations, and war, which had already accomplished what the U.S. government had wanted. New policy focused specifically on breaking up reservations and tribal lands by granting land allotments to individual Native Americans and encouraging them to take up Euro-American style agriculture. The map on the slide is a reservation, supposedly land that Native Americans could hold without interference, that the U.S. government has then divided into allotments. You can see that the US government was obsessed with fitting everything into boxes and grids, whether this made any sense in terms of the nature of the land itself or the people on it. Government reasoning went that if a person adopted white clothing and culture, with individuals farming land owned by a person rather than a community in good American capitalist style, then these folks would gradually drop their Indianness and be assimilated into white American culture. Basically, the US government felt that this would absolve them of any responsibility, financial or moral, for the wholesale occupation of Indian lands. This was the idea behind Indian boarding schools as well. And you see the children at one of those lined up in this slide. The idea of US government-run Indian boarding schools was that if you take children away from not only their parents, but any adults in their community, then those children will grow up ignorant of their own heritage and trained in white culture and values. This image, like others that you can find online, is a graphic representation of the aim of Indian boarding schools. These are the same three boys in both pictures. The Carlisle Indian School was considered a model for assimilating Native American children. The motto of the head of that school, whom I am not going to name here, was "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." This was supposed to refer to the assimilation of Indians into white America, industrial melting pot style with a vengeance. If you have followed the news for the past couple of years out of the US and Canada, then you know that these schools were often brutal and deadly to children. I'll read the headline here in case you are listening and not watching. US counts Indian boarding school deaths for first time, but leaves key questions unanswered. The Interior Department documented more than 500 deaths of Indigenous children, but it's far from a complete count. We have a long way to go, one expert said. The article was from 2023. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act, that I spoke about at the beginning of this section. The law authorized the President of the U.S. to break up reservation land, which was held in common by members of a tribe, into small allotments to be parceled out to individuals. Native Americans registering on a tribal roll were to be granted allotments of reservation land. Supposedly, the purpose of the Dawes Act and the subsequent acts that extended its initial provisions was to protect American Indian property rights, particularly during the land rushes of the 1890s. Realities made the claim of protection questionable at best. The land allotted to individual Native Americans included desert or near desert lands, entirely unsuitable for farming. The techniques of Euro-American farming were incompatible with the landscape and deliberately antithetical to the tribal way of life. Those Native Americans who did intend to farm often could not afford the tools, animals, seed, and other supplies necessary to get the farm started, and they received zero assistance from the U.S. government with regard to this. Tribes were underpaid for the land allotments, and when individuals did not or could not conform to the government requirements, their allotments were sold to non-native individuals, causing American Indian communities to lose vast acreage of what was left of tribal or reserved lands. This takeover under the guise of protection did not end with the 19th century. You will see the date I've circled on this particular map is from the early 20th century. Key points for Lecture 8. Pressure from original European colonial settlement and then the growth of the United States affected Native American groups before they had direct contact with the U.S. government because it squeezed Indian groups together into ever smaller spaces. During and after the American Civil War, the U.S. government pursued a policy toward Native Americans of removal, treaties, often then broken by the U.S., confinement to land reservations, and war. The U.S. government used Indian removal to clear the way for railroads, white settlers, and access to mineral resources like coal. The U.S. used a checkerboard land distribution system in which alternating plots of land along a Western railroad belonged to the railroad company and the U.S. government. Despite being supposedly backed by powerful financiers like Leland Stanford, the U.S. government basically paid for the Transcontinental Railroad while the owners made steady profits. The U.S. government financed the transcontinental railroads by issuing land grants. The railroads could then sell the land and keep the money, issuing government-backed bonds to be sold by railroads, not collecting even close to the full amount of loans paid out to railroads, and paying the interest on loans taken out by the railroad companies. The Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864 first parceled out alternate plots of land to railroads. The Homestead Act of 1862 set up the rules for distributing the government-owned plots. Homesteaders got land free if they lived on it for 5 years and made improvements, a house, a well, plowing, and fencing. But speculators could buy land for a set price per acre. Land speculators bought up land from both railroads and the U.S. government and then sold it on to settlers at a higher price. From the 1870s, U.S. policy towards Native Americans switched over from treaties and reservations to assimilation. In this case, assimilation meant dressing, living, and thinking like white settlers. U.S. government-run Indian boarding schools took children from their parents and community with the idea of raising them with only white culture and viewpoints. These boarding schools tended to be abusive and not infrequently deadly. The Dawes Act of 1887 parceled out land on Indian reservations, much like the Homestead Act. In order to keep land, Native Americans had to accept Euro-American ideas of family, community, and land use. In one of my former classes, students asked for a bit on Western frontier mythology in Hollywood film. That is a big topic, so I am only going to do this for show and movie posters by decade in chronological order, starting with the 1880s and ending with the 2020s. There are still Westerns, apparently. This is actually a TV show that came out when I first did this coda. I haven't seen this, so I may be misled by the advertisements, but the symbolism here is straight up American Western frontier white courage and grit, even though it's set in 1923. Celebratory white American historian Frederick Jackson Turner famously declared the American frontier and Great West over in 1893. The TV show on the previous slide was set in 1923, 30 years, only 3 decades after Turner, and it was made in 2023, 130 years after Turner. The whole end of the frontier Wild West fantasy became part of white American identity, especially masculine identity, in the late 19th century and continuing into the 20th. This image of America rested then and continues to rest on the mythology of independent white men forging a new civilization. And that word civilization is important still, succeeding through their own courage, strength, tenacity, and wisdom with absolutely no outside help. This despite the fact that settlers, ranchers, mining, and railroad companies relied on U.S. government claims and army actions against a number of cultures and populations in order to settle at all. There were Western films in the 1910s, but not so many posters, at least not ones that survive with an easy Google search. And before that, at the end of the 19th century, there were live Wild West shows. There is so much to think about in all of these posters, and I'm quite certain that if you are still watching at this point, you are also thinking. So I am not going to belabor these. Because of my own downtime interests, though, I find the image in the lower left fascinating in the respect that Buffalo Bill's aesthetic here is very much a version of Charles first adapted to a frontier location. Charles I was the monarch executed in the English Civil War back in 1649 by Parliament and Oliver Cromwell. The connection of this presentation, complete with hat, facial hairstyle, head hairstyle, would have communicated something to his audience at the time. And I always kind of wondered what he was going for here. You may have noticed or will see coming up that not all movies considered Westerns are set in the American West. The one thing that does not change is the lone heroic white man. And somehow he's still lone, even if there are other people around him. He is a strong, self-sufficient character that everyone else relies on, except for silly things like laundry. The hero of these movies was always white, and that was a big part of the point. Anyone non-white appeared as a caricature of a stereotype. Prior to the 21st century, there were sporadic attempts, this in the 1920s, to cast a white woman as the lead character. But the reality is that the biggest role of white women in any sort of films through the entire 20th century was to serve as a reward for heroic white men. Even as a supposed lead character, a woman always had to fulfill the era's sexy, hot, feisty, but not actually self-sufficient role. Latinas did appear sometimes in these films and were basically used as a symbol for exotic, sexy, hot. With the exception of Anna May Wong, Asian women rarely appeared. And if they did, as in Anna May Wong's case, they were cast as at least dangerous, if not outright evil, all while being exotic and sexy, hot. According to 20th century Westerns, Black women just did not exist, which is odd, the snark, since we know from history that there were many Black women west of the Mississippi, willingly and not, during U.S. colonial westward expansion. The images here are Dolores Del Rio and Anna May Wong, and the eyebrows are very, very much 1930s. In the 1930s here, we have Buck Jones as the lone rider, which pretty much says everything. It is interesting that at least in the two right posters, the idea of rugged masculinity in the 1930s compared to American standards now is a bit slight and very made up. You can see that they're wearing makeup here. Oh, Susanna has a woman's name in the title, but we also get that she is not the subject of the film. That would be the character played by Jean Autry, but she ranks slightly above the horse as part of the setting for the male lead. The 1940s, these have to be pre-World War II, at least the Errol Flynn one, with a quite particular 1930s to World War II image of dashing masculinity, very much in line with the British colonial aesthetic. If you cannot read the bit in the upper left of the left-hand poster, it says, "Through bandit bullets and Indian arrows, the Pony Express rides." For the record, the Pony Express was a mail, that would be M-A-I-L, not M-A-L-E, although you might wonder from the poster. Anyway, a mail delivery service that lasted the big 5 months, from April 1860 to October 1861, before being swiftly replaced by the telegraph. The 1950s. There were tons of Westerns made in the 1950s. The national mood, the US national mood, was celebratory coming out of victory in World War II and anxious but belligerent in the early years of the Cold War, and a détente of mutually assured nuclear destruction with the Soviet Union. The Joan Crawford film is given a male name and basically relies on the plot device of rescuing the feisty white woman in trousers just in the nick of time by the titular man. Shane is based on a short book which used to be assigned regularly in K-12 education, at least through the 1980s. Seven Samurai is a Kurosawa film. I actually love the story of the film. Kurosawa made samurai films, intentionally relying on the lone male trope of American Westerns. He did this so successfully that Hollywood stole his stories and turned them into Westerns, many of them with Clint Eastwood as lead actor. If you've heard of The Magnificent Seven, it is straight up and acknowledged plagiarism of Seven Samurai. Seven Samurai came out in 1954, the original Magnificent Seven in 1960, and the remake of The Magnificent Seven in 2016. We should probably think about the fact that both Japan and the US turned to violent but regretful lone male hero figures in the wake of World War II. John Wayne is starting to appear, although mercifully we don't have to see his smug face yet. Gary Cooper was really big in the 1950s, but has dropped out of popular memory. He was cast in roles that were significantly less misogynistic than those taken by John Wayne. The last thing that I will draw your attention to on the 1950s slide is the title of the movie on the top left here, Top Gun. The plot is exactly what you would expect. The strong but tormented white male lead character is the best gunfighter in the West and is called upon to heroically save the poor put upon villagers or settlers. Just a quick return to reality. The U.S. Army was the group that tended to kill off both bandits and Native Americans in favor of white settlers. These were not lone heroes, despite the mythology of General Custer and Andrew Jackson. The Americans who actually fought were ordinary white kids of the time or Black boys in segregated units, farm boys who went and hated other people on demand and killed those folks on demand. The popularity of Westerns continued into the 1960s, from the 1950s into the 1960s. John Wayne, sadly, was front and center. His films are some of the most misogynistic movies I have seen and wish that I had never seen, which is saying a great deal, as Westerns are at heart misogynistic as well as racist. The John Wayne films popularized physical abuse of women and made it not only masculine, but expected of any true-blooded American. Violence against other groups was so common as to be unremarkable. These films gained even greater popularity among white audiences in the context of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movements, the anti-Vietnam student movement, and even more to the point, the gain, however infinitesimal, of a voice in politics, even on the local school board, by any marginalized individuals. We aren't even getting to full groups here. I will just observe that as these Westerns were being made in the 1960s, Malcolm X was shot in 1964, Martin Luther King was shot in 1968, and Robert Kennedy was shot in 1968. I am giving a few big names here. The day-to-day regularized violence affected thousands who were not known names beyond their own life space. Westerns served that reality of pervasive violence against anyone who is not white, male, Protestant, and heterosexual. Clint Eastwood basically played the same character in a series of films, all of those pretty much taken wholesale from Kurosawa. The last one on this slide, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, was one of a number of stories in the 1960s centered on the sympathetic outlaw. I'm going to state what you all probably already have thought. In order to be sympathetic, an outlaw had to be white in these movies. Black men, remember, somehow Black women miraculously did not exist, Native American anyone, Latinx and Asian anyone, all of whom, like Black women, somehow managed to do the lion's share of the actual labor while remaining invisible. Any of these who broke any law, including in the case of escaped enslaved people claiming their own lives and bodies, were criminals. After all, the law is the law. Work on changing the law, not breaking it. Am I right? Snark here. Unhealthy levels of snark. If a white guy saved your body for you, though, and you were a helpless victim, then it was okay. Generally, vanishingly few people now know who Lee Van Cleef was. Basically, if you saw his name on a movie poster, you would know that he would be playing a villain. I think that I looked for him because the actor was missing part of a finger and still managed to play badass and villainous characters. Sergio Leone here, in addition to being the ugly in this particular film, was the director and credited with basically inventing the spaghetti western. Ask if you don't know what that is. And you will note that Clint Eastwood's career as the inscrutable in a sexy way lone white hero is absolutely solid at this point. If you know Clint Eastwood at all now, it is probably because he periodically runs for some office in California on the Republican ticket until 2008 and Libertarian since that. He was born in 1930 and is not far off of hitting the century mark now. And finally, we have the original Star Wars with Harrison Ford in the role of flawed but golden-hearted outlaw and Luke Skywalker as the lone hero before coming full circle and having Harrison Ford starring in the TV show that you saw at the beginning of the coda. Star Wars was ripped from Eastwood films, which in turn made extensive use of Kurosawa films. Star Wars, the original, borrowed heavily from Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress, despite the fact that Hollywood axed any relationship with Kurosawa in those years, and that Lucas had to overcome objections that he was borrowing from Kurosawa. Objections not for Kurosawa's sake. This is my child youth. As a tween, I waited in line for hours to see Star Wars after it had already been out for several weeks. Yep, I'm into that old lady reminiscing phase of life. Then, ushering in the 1980s was Urban Cowboy, set in the time in which it came out, the 80s. I tried to decide whether I wanted to quote heavily from Wikipedia on this movie or just send you to Wikipedia for information on this movie. I am sending you to Wikipedia yourselves for Urban Cowboy. The entry is not hideously long by Wikipedia standards, and at least the part I read before I started to remember how much I hated the movie got it right. When you read the entry on Urban Cowboy, try to picture the story if the central characters were Black or Latinx or Asian. People from any Muslim majority countries didn't yet exist in this Hollywood Americana reality. There were still some basic Westerns, meaning at least ostensibly set in the Old West. The Long Riders is definitely one of those white men get to be sympathetic outlaw films, in this case using the name of Jesse James, who is an actual person. The outlaws kill ordinary folks, but only because everything went wrong, not because the outlaws are not totally admirable characters, even though, yeah. And the hero outlaw can only be killed by treachery. We are all meant to mourn the loss of his coolness, even if it was a bit misguided. And then there's Top Gun, released in 1986, 2 years after I started college as an undergrad. And yes, I did have that hairstyle and a bomber jacket. The story and the message are the Top Gun movie from the 1950s, just updated to fighter jets in the Cold War. And I will specify the second half of the Cold War. In the 1950s, and at the time of the release of the original no Tom Cruise Top Gun, the US was just emerging from World War II and just starting to conceive of the actual potential for nuclear Armageddon. In 1980, your young movie audience had never known any reality outside of the Cold War and the constant likelihood of nuclear Armageddon. But somehow, the balance of the world still rested on the lone, sulky, white male hero. I will also point out that in every case, the female supporting character was hailed as aggressive and breaking new ground in women's position in society. I know I felt all powerfulized by this photo of the white female lead in the 1980s on the upper right. On the other hand, at least I existed, sort of, as a young white woman. And really, I shouldn't grumble. The actress playing the female lead in the 2022 film is actually a bit less than 10 years younger than Cruise. That's monumental for Hollywood, which tends toward, well, Carrie Fisher was 14 years younger than Harrison Ford when the original Star Wars came out. Sean Young was 17 years younger than Harrison Ford when the first Blade Runner came out, and Anne Hatch was 26 years younger than Ford when 6 Days, 7 Nights was filmed. The quotes on the slide are from a Manchester newspaper and apply to the 2022 sequel movie. Again, if you are just listening, I will read them. Top Gun: Maverick. Everything you'd expect and worse. The best thing I could say about Top Gun: Maverick, the long-awaited sequel to the 1986 Cold War blockbuster, is that it eventually ends. This is the 1990s, and I have to admit that I did not see many movies in the 1990s, nor have I since. The ads for Dances with Wolves suggested yet another white savior story. Tombstone, I don't even remember the ads. And Unforgiven, I did see, and I hated it so much that I tried not to think of it, ever. The only thing that I really remember about it is that it doubled down on the message that violence is forgivable and reasonable if it is done by men at their own discretion, but that violence for the sake of a woman at the request of women is bound to be evil and unreasonable. These are the 2000s. I've put aughts so that you know I'm not including the 2010s or the 2020s on this slide here. I know that the one on the right got a lot of press. I didn't see it. I remember nothing about the movie trailers except that they were ubiquitous. So I have nothing useful to say. If you have seen No Country for Old Men and have an opinion on it, I would love to hear it. The one on the left is another dedicated to the outlaw Jesse James. And I've already talked about the sympathetic white outlaw genre, but you'll notice that it's called The Assassination of Jesse James. This is a selection from the 2010s. I have seen none of them, so any analysis that I have is based on the posters here only. There is a face that is probably Native American, and a film with a Black male lead. So we are meant to feel quite progressive, and maybe these are worthwhile representations, but knowing Hollywood, I'm not holding my breath. In terms of style relating to earlier Western precedent that we've just seen, Hostiles makes me think of the Buffalo Bill advertisements from the 19th century. Hell or High Water reads as a John Wayne sort of character. Django is referencing the Clint Eastwood films. The reference is deliberate and self-aware, so maybe it was successful. Again, I don't know. Dark Valley also has an updated Clint Eastwood aesthetic, but doesn't read as even being tongue-in-cheek or saying anything beyond, look, it's a lone white heroic figure. The Hateful Eight is referencing the Magnificent Seven and thus the Seven Samurai, and the image is in keeping with that. I think this poster alone in the group may actually have a visible woman, probably white, who probably needs to be saved along with the other not quite masculine enough men in the town. Although it is a Tarantino film, so they probably all just die in a variety of graphic and not really meaningful ways. I will leave you to contextualize and analyze movie posters from Westerns made in the 2020s. Here we have the Top Gun remake, No Man's Land, The Harder They Fall, Apache Junction, and Old Henry. Our background detail for this lecture has been from a pair of Huron moccasins made around 1880. These incorporate several European trade goods, including wool, silk, beads, and sequins, but the work is quintessentially Native American.